The 38th floor of Meridian Financial Tower hummed with an energy that only came when billions of dollars hung in the balance. At 3:47 in the morning, the executive conference room glowed like a beacon against the sleeping city below, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's skeletal skyline. Inside, Victoria Sterling adjusted her designer glasses and studied the merger documents spread across the mahogany table like battle plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Dynamics, Victoria had orchestrated 17 major acquisitions in her 12-year tenure. But nothing compared to the magnitude of what lay before her, $12 billion. The acquisition of Hartwell Industries would catapult her company into the upper echelons of corporate America, transforming Sterling Dynamics from a respected mid-tier firm into an industry titan overnight. The paperwork was pristine, the legal teams had signed off, and the board of directors waited eagerly for her final signature at tomorrow's emergency meeting. Yet something gnawed at her. Victoria had learned to trust her instincts in the cutthroat world of corporate finance, and tonight those instincts whispered warnings she couldn't quite articulate. She pushed back from the conference table, her heels clicking against the polished marble as she walked to the window. The city stretched endlessly before her, a maze of ambition and dreams, each light representing someone's livelihood, someone's future. 3 floors below, in the mechanical rooms that most executives never knew existed, Marcus Thompson pushed his cleaning cart down the narrow maintenance corridor. The wheels squeaked rhythmically, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his nights for the past 18 months. At 32, Marcus possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that academia had once recognized, but circumstances had buried beneath layers of necessity and survival. His daughter Emma slept peacefully in their 1-bedroom apartment across town, her 7-year-old dreams blissfully unaware of the financial tightrope her father walked daily. The babysitter, Mrs. Rodriguez from down the hall, had long since dozed off on their second-hand couch, her weathered hands still clutching the romance novel she'd been reading. Marcus had calculated the exact amount of time he needed to complete his cleaning route, catch the first subway train, and arrive home before Emma's alarm clock announced another school day. But tonight felt different. Tonight, as he emerged from the service elevator onto the 38th floor, Marcus noticed something unusual. The executive conference room blazed with light, its occupants silhouetted against the windows like a figure in a painting. In his 18 months of cleaning these floors, Marcus had never encountered anyone working this late, this high up in the corporate hierarchy. Victoria Sterling had not always been the iron-willed executive who now commanded boardrooms with surgical precision. 20 years earlier, she had been Victoria Chun, a scholarship student at Columbia Business School with calloused hands from her weekend job at her family's laundromat in Queens. Her parents, immigrants who had sacrificed everything for their daughter's education, had instilled in her a work ethic that bordered on obsession and a moral compass that pointed toward helping others climb the same ladder she had ascended. The transformation from Victoria Chun to Victoria Sterling had been gradual, marked by a series of calculated decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation, but collectively reshaped her identity. The name change came first, suggested by a career counselor who explained that American executives would find Sterling more approachable than Chun. The wardrobe followed, then the accent coaching, and finally the careful construction of a backstory that emphasized her Ivy League credentials, while glossing over the immigrant struggle that had forged her character. By the time she reached the executive level, Victoria had become a master of compartmentalization. She donated generously to scholarship funds and immigration advocacy groups, assuaging the guilt that occasionally surfaced during quiet moments. Her professional success had enabled her to move her aging parents into a comfortable retirement community, And she told herself that the compromises along the way had been necessary investments in a greater good. Yet as she stood in the conference room at nearly 4 a.m, studying documents that would reshape thousands of lives, the weight of those compromises pressed against her chest like a physical force. The Hartwell Industries acquisition was not simply a business transaction. It was a consolidation that would eliminate redundancies, streamline operations, and inevitably result in massive layoffs. The efficiency gains that made the deal so attractive to shareholders would come at the cost of approximately 8,000 jobs across 6 states. Victoria had reviewed the projections with the detached analytical mindset that had served her throughout her career. The numbers were compelling, the strategic advantages undeniable, and the shareholder value creation substantial. But tonight, alone with the documents and her thoughts, she found herself thinking about faces rather than figures. 8,000 families. 8,000 people who would wake up one morning to find their worlds fundamentally altered by decisions made in boardrooms they would never see. The sound of wheels squeaking in the hallway outside interrupted her contemplation. Victoria glanced toward the door, surprised to discover that anyone else occupied the building at this hour. Through the frosted glass, she could see the silhouette of a figure pushing what appeared to be a cleaning cart. The sight reminded her of her own late-night shifts during college, when she had cleaned office buildings to supplement her scholarship money and send a few dollars home to her parents. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus Thompson had noticed the light in the conference room from the moment he stepped off the elevator, but protocol dictated that he work around occupied spaces rather than interrupt important business. In his 18 months at Sterling Dynamics, he had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through the corporate landscape like a ghost who left behind only gleaming surfaces and empty wastebaskets. The executives who occasionally crossed his path offered polite nods at best, their eyes typically focused on phones or documents rather than the man who maintained their pristine environment. Tonight, however, curiosity overcame caution. The unusual hour and the solitary occupant of the conference room created an atmosphere that felt different from his typical encounters with the corporate elite. As Marcus approached the frosted glass door, he could see the figure inside more clearly. A woman in an expensive suit stood with her back to the door, her posture suggesting deep contemplation rather than active work. Marcus had learned to read the body language of stress during his previous life, when he had been Dr. Marcus Thompson, a forensic accountant with a prestigious consulting firm downtown. That seemed like a lifetime ago now, before the diagnosis that had turned his world upside down and forced him to choose between his career and his daughter's needs. Emma had been only 5 when the doctors delivered the news about her rare autoimmune condition, and the experimental treatments that offered the best hope for her future were not covered by any insurance plan Marcus could afford. The mathematics of his situation had been brutal in their simplicity. His salary as a forensic accountant, while substantial by most standards, could not cover both the ongoing medical expenses and the basic necessities of their daily life. The consulting firm's health insurance had maximum lifetime benefits that would be exhausted within 2 years of Emma's treatment regimen. When his wife Sarah had been offered a research position at a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland, with health benefits that would cover Emma's condition completely, the decision had been agonizing but clear. Sarah had taken Emma to Geneva 18 months ago, ostensibly for a temporary assignment that would provide the medical care their daughter needed while Marcus maintained their life in New York. The temporary arrangement had gradually become permanent as Emma's health stabilized and Sarah's career flourished in the international pharmaceutical industry. They spoke via video calls twice a week, Emma chattering excitedly about her new school and friends, while Sarah provided updates on treatment protocols and test results. Marcus had initially planned to join them in Switzerland once he could arrange a work visa and find employment in his field. But the months had stretched into seasons, and the complexity of international employment requirements had proven more challenging than anticipated. Meanwhile, his cleaning job at Sterling Dynamics provided the steady income needed to maintain their New York apartment and contribute to Emma's ongoing medical expenses. The work was honest, if humbling, and the night shift allowed him to maintain some semblance of his former professional connections during daytime hours. The irony was not lost on Marcus that he now cleaned the offices of the very type of executives he had once advised on financial irregularities and corporate malfeasance. His trained eye still automatically assessed the documents and conversations he encountered during his cleaning rounds, though he maintained strict professional boundaries about confidentiality. The ethical standards that had governed his previous career remained intact, even if his circumstances had changed dramatically. As Marcus paused outside the conference room, his forensic accountant instincts activated almost involuntarily. The scattered documents visible through the glass, the late hour, and the solitary executive suggested a situation that warranted careful attention. In his former professional life, he had learned that the most significant corporate decisions often occurred in exactly these types of circumstances. Late-night meetings, isolated decision-makers, and time pressure frequently created conditions where ethical shortcuts seemed attractive and oversight mechanisms failed. Victoria sensed the presence in the hallway before she actually saw the figure. Years of corporate paranoia had honed her awareness of being observed, and she turned slowly toward the door. Through the frosted glass, she could see someone standing motionless outside the conference room. The position suggested not someone hurrying past on routine business, but rather someone who had stopped deliberately. For a moment, Victoria felt a flash of irritation. Her late-night work sessions were sacred time, free from the interruptions and politics that characterized her daytime schedule. The cleaning staff typically worked efficiently and unobtrusively, completing their tasks without requiring acknowledgement or interaction. This breach of the unspoken protocol felt intrusive, particularly given the sensitivity of the documents spread across the conference table. But as Victoria moved closer to the door, her irritation gave way to curiosity. The figure in the hallway remained perfectly still, suggesting not impatience or urgency, but rather careful consideration. Something about the posture struck her as familiar, though she could not immediately place the association. The stance suggested someone accustomed to observation and analysis, someone who saw patterns and details that others might miss. Victoria opened the conference room door, expecting to encounter a cleaning person seeking permission to work around her schedule. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man whose appearance defied easy categorization. Marcus Thompson wore the standard uniform of the custodial staff, but his bearing suggested education and professional experience that seemed incongruous with his current role. His eyes, intelligent and assessing, met hers directly rather than deferring in the manner she had come to expect from service personnel. Marcus had not intended to initiate contact with the executive in the conference room, but when the door opened suddenly, he found himself in an unavoidable interaction. His first instinct was to offer a polite apology and continue with his cleaning route, but something about the woman's expression gave him pause. Rather than the dismissive annoyance he had anticipated, her face showed surprise mixed with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Victoria Sterling was smaller in person than she appeared in the corporate photographs that adorned Sterling Dynamics' annual reports and marketing materials. Her professional attire was immaculate despite the late hour, but her expression seemed less controlled than the polished public image Marcus had observed from a distance. Dark circles under her eyes suggested that late-night work sessions were becoming routine rather than exceptional, and her posture indicated the kind of stress that accumulated over months rather than days. The silence between them stretched for several seconds, each waiting for the other to establish the parameters of their interaction. Marcus had learned during his previous career that initial moments often revealed crucial information about people's character and motivations. Victoria Sterling's hesitation suggested someone grappling with decisions that extended beyond routine business matters, while her direct eye contact indicated confidence tempered by uncertainty. Victoria broke the silence first, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism that had become second nature but softened by fatigue. She asked if Marcus needed access to the conference room for cleaning, assuming that his presence outside indicated routine maintenance requirements. The question was courteous but carried the implicit expectation that he would defer to her schedule and return at a more convenient time. Marcus responded that he could easily work around her schedule, but as he spoke, his eyes inadvertently scanned the documents visible on the conference table. His forensic training had conditioned him to absorb information quickly and accurately, and even the brief glimpse revealed familiar patterns. Merger documents, financial projections, and legal agreements were arranged in the methodical manner he recognized from his previous professional life. More significantly, the specific formatting and structure suggested a transaction of enormous scope and complexity. Victoria noticed Marcus's gaze lingering on the conference table and felt a protective instinct about the confidential materials. Her initial inclination was to close the door and terminate the interaction immediately, but something about Marcus's expression suggested not idle curiosity, but rather professional recognition. The way he assessed the documents reminded her of the financial consultants and legal advisors who regularly reviewed similar materials in her presence. Instead of dismissing Marcus, Victoria found herself asking whether he had worked in financial services before joining the custodial staff. The question emerged from genuine curiosity rather than polite conversation, driven by her instinct that his background contained elements that were not immediately apparent. In her experience, people with Marcus's apparent education and bearing typically did not pursue cleaning positions unless circumstances had forced significant life changes. Marcus hesitated before responding, uncertain whether honesty would jeopardize his employment or create unnecessary complications. The cleaning job at Sterling Dynamics provided crucial stability for his family situation, and he could not afford to risk his position through indiscretion or presumption. However, Victoria's question seemed genuine rather than confrontational, and her tone suggested curiosity rather than suspicion. After a moment's consideration, Marcus acknowledged that he had previously worked as a forensic accountant, specializing in corporate compliance and financial irregularity detection. He explained briefly that family circumstances had necessitated a career change, though he avoided details about Emma's medical condition and Sarah's relocation. The explanation was truthful but incomplete, designed to satisfy Victoria's curiosity. Without inviting deeper personal questions, Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly at Marcus's revelation, her expression shifting from polite interest to genuine surprise. Forensic accountants occupied a specialized niche in the financial world, requiring advanced education, professional certification, and the kind of analytical skills that commanded substantial salaries. The transition from that career level to custodial work suggested dramatic circumstances that Victoria found intriguing despite herself. The revelation also explained Marcus's initial reaction to the conference room documents. A trained forensic accountant would immediately recognize merger materials and understand their significance, whereas a typical cleaning person would likely show no interest in corporate paperwork. Victoria realized that Marcus had probably absorbed more information about the Hartwell Industries transaction in those few seconds than most people would glean from hours of explanation. For Marcus, Victoria's surprise confirmed his assessment that she was grappling with decisions that extended beyond routine business matters. Her willingness to engage in conversation with a member of the custodial staff suggested either exceptional approachability or unusual stress levels that had lowered her normal professional barriers. Given the late hour and the nature of the documents on the conference table, Marcus suspected the latter explanation was more likely. The conversation that followed departed from the typical script of executive staff interactions at Sterling Dynamics. Rather than the polite but distant exchanges that characterized most such encounters, Victoria found herself genuinely interested in Marcus's background and perspective. Her questions about his previous career revealed a curiosity that surprised them both, while Marcus's responses demonstrated the analytical thinking that had made him successful in his former profession. Victoria learned that Marcus had specialized in detecting financial irregularities and compliance violations for mid-sized corporations, work that required not only technical expertise, but also the intuition to recognize patterns that might escape traditional auditing processes. His clients had typically been companies facing regulatory scrutiny or stakeholder concerns about financial transparency, situations where independent verification was essential for maintaining credibility and avoiding legal complications. Marcus, in turn, sensed that Victoria was wrestling with decisions that had implications beyond her immediate corporate responsibilities. His experience with executives under pressure had taught him to recognize the signs of ethical stress, and Victoria's demeanor suggested someone confronting choices that challenged her personal values. The late hour and solitary work session reinforced his assessment that she was avoiding the normal corporate infrastructure that might influence or complicate her decision-making process. As their conversation continued, Victoria found herself sharing more information than she had originally intended. She explained that the merger documents represented a transformational opportunity for Sterling Dynamics, but one that carried significant human costs in terms of employment reduction and operational consolidation. The business case was compelling from a shareholder perspective, but the personal implications for thousands of employees weighed heavily on her conscience. Marcus listened carefully, his forensic training helping him understand not only the explicit information Victoria provided, but also the underlying concerns she was reluctant to articulate directly. His experience with corporate mergers had taught him that the human costs were often understated in initial projections, while the financial benefits were frequently overstated due to optimistic assumptions about integration efficiency and market response. The conversation gradually shifted from polite exchanges to something approaching professional consultation. Though neither explicitly acknowledged the transition, Victoria began describing specific aspects of the merger structure, seeking Marcus's perspective on elements that had generated her unease. Marcus responded with the kind of analytical insights that had made him valuable to his former clients, identifying potential risks and complications that might not be immediately apparent to executives, focused primarily on strategic advantages. What emerged from their discussion was a picture of a merger that was more complex and potentially problematic than the sanitized presentations Victoria had received from her legal and financial advisors. Marcus's questions revealed assumptions in the merger projections that seemed optimistic to the point of being unrealistic, while his observations about integration challenges highlighted risks that had not been adequately addressed in the planning process. More troubling from Marcus's perspective were subtle indicators in the documentation structure that suggested information asymmetries between the merging parties. His forensic experience had taught him to recognize when one party in a transaction possessed material information that was not being shared with counterparts, creating conditions for fraud or manipulation. While he could not definitively identify specific irregularities based on his brief exposure to the documents, several elements triggered the pattern recognition that had made him successful in his previous career. Victoria found Marcus's insights both illuminating and disturbing. His observations validated concerns she had been unable to articulate clearly, while his questions revealed gaps in her own understanding of the transaction's implications. The due diligence process that had led to the merger agreement had been thorough by conventional standards, but Marcus's perspective suggested that conventional standards might be inadequate for a transaction of this magnitude and complexity. As their conversation deepened, Victoria began to understand why Marcus had been successful as a forensic accountant. His ability to identify patterns and irregularities seemed almost intuitive, while his communication skills allowed him to explain complex financial concepts in terms that were accessible without being condescending. The combination of technical expertise and interpersonal effectiveness was relatively rare in the financial consulting world, making his current employment situation even more puzzling. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself increasingly concerned about what he was learning regarding the Hartwell Industries merger. While he could not access the detailed documentation necessary for a comprehensive analysis, the information Victoria shared suggested several red flags that warranted further investigation. His professional experience had taught him that mergers, structured with the characteristics she described, often concealed significant problems that became apparent only after transactions were completed and irreversible. The ethical implications of their conversation were not lost on either participant. Victoria was sharing confidential corporate information with someone who, regardless of his background, was not authorized to receive such materials. Marcus was providing professional consultation without proper engagement agreements or conflict of interest disclosures. Both understood that their interaction violated numerous corporate policies and professional protocols. Yet neither felt inclined to terminate the conversation. Victoria had not experienced such insightful analysis of her business challenges in months, while Marcus found intellectual stimulation that had been absent from his life since leaving his previous career. More importantly, both sensed that their discussion might be revealing information crucial to the welfare of thousands of people who would be affected by the merger decision. As the night progressed and their conversation continued, Victoria and Marcus began to recognize that their chance encounter might represent more than coincidental timing. The combination of Victoria's growing concerns about the merger and Marcus's analytical expertise created an opportunity to examine the transaction from perspectives that had not been available through conventional channels. While neither could have predicted the circumstances that brought them together in the conference room at 4 a.m, both began to sense that their meeting might be significant beyond their individual situations. The foundation for what would become an extraordinary partnership in corporate investigation and ethical decision-making was being established through their initial conversation, though neither yet understood the full implications of what they were beginning to uncover. As dawn approached and the city began to stir beyond the conference room windows, Victoria and Marcus found themselves committed to a collaboration that would challenge everything they thought they knew about corporate power, personal integrity, and the courage required to do what was right when the stakes were measured in billions of dollars and thousands of lives. The executive washroom on the 38th floor had never served as a clandestine meeting place before Victoria Sterling began leaving forensic accounting textbooks on the marble countertop. 3 days after her first encounter with Marcus Thompson, she had impulsively purchased a collection of financial analysis guides from a downtown bookstore, telling herself she needed to refresh her understanding of complex merger structures. The books found their way to the washroom because it was the only location in Sterling Dynamics where she could be certain of privacy from her assistants, board members, and the endless parade of consultants who monitored her every professional move. Marcus discovered the first book during his routine cleaning rounds, recognizing immediately that its placement was intentional rather than accidental. Corporate executives did not typically study forensic accounting principles unless they suspected irregularities that required specialized analysis. The textbook's pages were filled with highlighting and marginal notes in Victoria's precise handwriting, indicating serious study rather than casual browsing. More tellingly, several passages dealing with merger fraud detection were marked with asterisks and question marks that suggested specific concerns rather than general interest. The unconventional communication system evolved organically over the following week. Victoria would leave documents, questions, or research materials in predetermined locations throughout the executive floor, while Marcus would respond with analysis, observations, or additional questions written on cleaning supplies inventory. Sheets that Victoria would find tucked discreetly into her desk drawer. Neither acknowledged their covert correspondence during the occasional daytime encounters in hallways or elevators, maintaining the professional distance expected between executives and custodial staff. Through this paper trail, Victoria learned that Marcus's forensic expertise extended far beyond basic financial analysis. His handwritten responses demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international money laundering techniques, regulatory compliance requirements, and the subtle methods corporations use to conceal material information from stakeholders. More impressively, his observations about the Hartwell Industries merger identified specific areas where additional investigation might reveal problems that had escaped traditional due diligence processes. Marcus, meanwhile, began to understand the full scope of Victoria's dilemma. Her questions revealed a CEO grappling not only with the technical complexities of a massive merger, but also with the ethical implications of decisions that would affect thousands of lives. Her research into forensic accounting principles was driven by genuine concern that the information provided by her advisors might be incomplete or deliberately misleading. The marginal notes in her textbook showed someone trying to educate herself quickly about subjects that most executives delegated entirely to specialists. The turning point in their clandestine collaboration came when Victoria left Marcus a copy of Hartwell Industries' quarterly earnings reports from the previous 2 years. The documents were publicly available through regulatory filings, but Victoria's specific request for analysis suggested she had identified inconsistencies that warranted expert review. Marcus spent his next 3 nights off studying the financial statements with the methodical attention he had once applied to client investigations. What he discovered exceeded his worst expectations. The earnings reports contained subtle, but systematic irregularities that suggested sophisticated accounting manipulation designed to inflate Hartwell's apparent value. Revenue recognition patterns were inconsistent across reporting periods. Depreciation schedules had been altered without adequate explanation, and reserve allocations showed unexplained fluctuations that bore no relationship to underlying business conditions. Most damning, the subsidiary structures described in regulatory filings did not match the operational descriptions provided in management presentations, suggesting deliberate obfuscation of the company's true financial position. Marcus's written analysis filled 14 pages of detailed observations, calculations, and recommendations for additional investigation. He documented specific instances where Hartwell's financial reporting violated generally accepted accounting principles, identified transactions that appeared designed to move liabilities off balance sheet, and highlighted relationships with affiliated entities that suggested potential conflicts of interest. The evidence pointed to a systematic effort to present Hartwell Industries as more valuable and less risky than its actual financial condition warranted. The implications for Sterling Dynamics were staggering. If Marcus's analysis was correct, the $12 billion merger would saddle Victoria's company with hidden liabilities, inflated asset values, and ongoing regulatory compliance problems that could destroy shareholder value and potentially trigger criminal investigations. The due diligence process conducted by Sterling's advisors had apparently failed to detect irregularities that a careful forensic review revealed within days. Victoria read Marcus's analysis twice before fully grasping its significance. Her business school education and corporate experience had prepared her to evaluate strategic opportunities and competitive advantages, but she lacked the specialized knowledge necessary to detect sophisticated accounting fraud. The revelation that her advisors had missed or ignored obvious warning signs raised disturbing questions about their competence, their thoroughness, or their integrity. More troubling was the timeline pressure that now constrained her options. The merger agreement required board approval within 10 days, and the preliminary shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following week. Postponing the transaction would require explanation to investors, regulators, and media outlets that monitored Sterling Dynamics' activities closely. The revelation of potential fraud at Hartwell Industries would likely trigger investigations that could take months or years to resolve, during which Sterling's stock price and reputation would suffer regardless of the ultimate findings. Yet, proceeding with the merger based on potentially fraudulent information would expose Sterling Dynamics to liability claims from shareholders, regulatory sanctions from government agencies, and criminal prosecution if the fraud was ultimately proven. Victoria found herself caught between the immediate consequences of delaying the transaction and the potentially catastrophic long-term effects of completing it based on false premises. Her next communication to Marcus reflected the urgency of her situation. Rather than leaving documents in their usual dead-drop locations, Victoria waited in the executive conference room until Marcus arrived for his cleaning routine, then invited him inside for a direct conversation. The risk of discovery by security cameras or overnight staff was substantial, but the complexity of their situation had outgrown their paper-based communication system. Marcus arrived at the conference room carrying his standard cleaning supplies, but prepared for a conversation that would likely determine the future direction of his involvement in Victoria's investigation. His analysis of Hartwell's financial statements had convinced him that the proposed merger represented not just a business mistake, but a potential crime that would ultimately harm thousands of innocent people. His ethical obligations as a former forensic accountant compelled him to share his findings, but his personal circumstances made any visible involvement extremely dangerous. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 4 hours and covered ground that neither had anticipated. When their collaboration began, Victoria shared details about the political pressures driving the merger timeline, the board dynamics that limited her unilateral decision-making authority, and the personal stake she had invested in the transaction's success. Her reputation as a transformational CEO was built on successful growth strategies, and the failure of such a significant merger would likely end her career, regardless of the underlying reasons. Marcus explained the technical aspects of his fraud analysis in terms Victoria could understand, walking her through specific examples of accounting manipulation and their implications for Hartwell's true financial condition. He also described the investigative steps that would be necessary to build a definitive case, the regulatory reporting requirements that might apply to their discoveries, and the potential criminal liability that could attach to executives who proceeded with transactions based on known false information. What emerged from their discussion was a strategy that acknowledged both the ethical imperative to prevent a fraudulent merger and the practical constraints that limited their options. For intervention, Marcus would continue his forensic analysis, using publicly available information and any additional documents Victoria could provide, while Victoria would begin asking targeted questions of her advisors designed to test whether they had conducted adequate due diligence or were complicit in concealing problems. The plan required careful coordination to avoid arousing suspicion while gathering evidence sufficient to justify halting the merger process. Marcus would focus on documenting specific instances of accounting fraud and identifying the individuals responsible for perpetrating or concealing the irregularities. Victoria would work to establish that her advisors had received information that should have triggered deeper investigation, creating a record that would demonstrate either negligence or intentional misconduct on their part. Neither anticipated that their investigation would reveal a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple accounting fraud to encompass bribery, regulatory capture, and corporate structures designed to facilitate money laundering for international criminal organizations. The Hartwell Industries merger was not simply an overvalued acquisition, but rather a vehicle for legitimizing billions of dollars in proceeds from drug trafficking, arms dealing, and human trafficking operations throughout Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. The evidence began accumulating when Marcus traced the ownership structures of Hartwell's subsidiary companies through public databases and regulatory filings. What appeared to be routine corporate entities proved to have directors and officers with connections to individuals sanctioned by the Treasury Department for money laundering activities. The complex web of holding companies and shell corporations was designed to obscure these relationships, but Marcus's forensic training enabled him to identify patterns that less experienced investigators would miss. Victoria's inquiries with her advisors yielded equally disturbing results. When she asked specific questions about Hartwell's compliance with anti-money laundering regulations, her legal team provided evasive responses that suggested they were aware of problems but reluctant to document their knowledge. Her investment bankers deflected questions about the source of Hartwell's recent capital infusions, citing confidentiality agreements that prevented disclosure of investor identities. Most damning was the response from Sterling's compliance officer. When Victoria requested copies of the background checks conducted on Hartwell's senior management, the compliance officer claimed that such checks were unnecessary for merger transactions and that requesting them might signal distrust that could jeopardize the deal's completion. The explanation was technically plausible but inconsistent with the thorough due diligence practices that had characterized Victoria's previous acquisitions. The pattern of evasion and misdirection convinced Victoria that her advisors were either incompetent beyond belief or actively participating in a scheme to conceal Hartwell's true nature from Sterling's board and shareholders. The legal and financial professionals who should have been protecting her company's interests appeared instead to be facilitating a transaction that would expose Sterling Dynamics to enormous financial and legal liability. Marcus's continued analysis revealed the scope of the criminal enterprise that Hartwell Industries had become under its current management. The company's legitimate manufacturing operations provided cover for an international money laundering network that processed proceeds from criminal activities throughout Asia and Europe. The proposed merger with Sterling Dynamics would provide additional legitimacy and access to American financial markets that would dramatically expand the network's capacity and reduce its exposure to law enforcement scrutiny. The merger documents themselves contained subtle provisions that would transfer operational control of key Hartwell subsidiaries to entities controlled by individuals with extensive criminal histories. These provisions were buried in hundreds of pages of legal text and structured to appear routine to reviewers unfamiliar with the underlying ownership structures. The average board member reviewing the merger agreement would not recognize the significance of clauses that effectively handed control of a multinational corporation to organized crime figures. Victoria's investigation of her advisors' backgrounds revealed financial relationships that explained their reluctance to identify problems with the merger. Her lead investment banker had received consulting fees from entities connected to Hartwell's criminal network, while her law firm had represented several companies that Marcus had identified as money laundering vehicles. The compliance officer, who had dismissed her concerns about background checks, had previously worked for a consulting firm that specialized in helping corporations avoid regulatory scrutiny. The corruption was not limited to Sterling's external advisors. Marcus's analysis of internal communications that Victoria shared revealed that several Sterling Dynamics executives had received payments or other benefits from Hartwell-related entities prior to the merger announcement. The payments were structured to appear legitimate through consulting agreements and speaking fees, but their timing and recipients suggested systematic bribery designed to ensure the merger's approval. Most shocking was the discovery that Sterling's board chairman had personal financial interests in entities that would benefit significantly from the merger's completion. The conflicts of interest were concealed through complex trust structures and offshore entities, but Marcus's forensic skills enabled him to trace the connections through public records and corporate filings. The chairman, who was supposed to provide independent oversight of the merger process, was actually positioned to profit personally from its completion, regardless of its impact on Sterling shareholders. The evidence that Marcus and Victoria accumulated painted a picture of corporate corruption that extended throughout Sterling Dynamics' leadership structure and external advisory network. The Hartwell Industries merger was not an isolated instance of fraud, but rather the culmination of a systematic effort to capture a major American corporation for the benefit of international criminal organizations. The $12 billion transaction price was not payment for legitimate business assets, but rather the cost of acquiring a platform for money laundering operations that would generate far greater profits over time. Victoria found herself confronting not only a fraudulent business transaction, but also the realization that her own company had been systematically compromised by individuals she had trusted with fiduciary responsibilities. The executives and advisors who should have been protecting Sterling's interests had instead been working to facilitate its capture by criminal enterprises. Her reputation, her career, and her personal integrity were all at stake, but the broader implications for Sterling's employees, shareholders, and customers were far more significant. Marcus understood that his involvement in exposing the conspiracy would likely end his employment at Sterling Dynamics and possibly expose him to retaliation from the criminal organizations involved. His family situation made any disruption to his income extremely dangerous, particularly given Emma's ongoing medical needs and the stability that his current employment provided. Yet his professional training and personal ethics made it impossible to ignore evidence of crimes that would ultimately harm thousands of innocent people. The collaboration between Victoria and Marcus had evolved from a chance encounter between a stressed executive and a knowledgeable janitor into a partnership between two people who found themselves uniquely positioned to prevent a massive crime. Neither had sought the responsibility that now rested on their shoulders, but both understood that their failure to act would make them complicit in the conspiracy they had uncovered. Their investigation had revealed the true nature of the Hartwell Industries merger and identified the individuals responsible for facilitating the fraud. The next phase of their collaboration would require them to decide how to use their knowledge to prevent the merger's completion while protecting themselves from retaliation by powerful interests, with strong incentives to ensure their silence. The stakes had escalated far beyond a simple business decision to encompass questions of corporate governance, international law enforcement, and personal survival in the face of criminal enterprises with global reach and unlimited resources. As Victoria and Marcus prepared to move from investigation to intervention, they understood that their success would depend not only on the strength of their evidence, but also on their ability to find allies within law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and the corporate governance system, who could act on their discoveries before the merger's completion made intervention impossible. The countdown to the board meeting that would approve the transaction had begun, and every day that passed made their task more difficult and more dangerous. The partnership forged in clandestine meetings and covert document exchanges had prepared them for a confrontation that would test not only their investigative skills, but also their courage in the face of adversaries who had demonstrated their willingness to corrupt executives, compromise institutions, and eliminate obstacles to their criminal objectives. The janitor and the CEO, who had discovered each other by chance, were about to challenge a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of corporate and political power, with consequences that neither could fully anticipate. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours before the federal deadline for regulatory approval of the Hartwell Industries acquisition. Victoria Sterling stood before the bathroom mirror in her penthouse apartment, applying concealer beneath eyes that had not seen restful sleep in 6 days. The evidence that she and Marcus had compiled filled 3 encrypted flash drives hidden in her jewelry box, each containing documentation that could destroy careers, trigger federal investigations, and potentially save thousands of jobs that would disappear once the money laundering operation achieved its objectives. Her reflection showed a woman transformed by the weight of knowledge that no corporate executive should have to bear alone. The confident CEO who had built Sterling Dynamics into a market leader had been replaced by someone who questioned every interaction, analyzed every document for hidden meanings, and wondered which of her longtime colleagues might be complicit in the conspiracy she had uncovered. The isolation was suffocating, made bearable only by her clandestine partnership with Marcus Thompson, whose forensic expertise had become her lifeline in navigating the treacherous waters of corporate espionage. 27 floors below, in the service basement of Sterling Dynamics headquarters, Marcus finished loading industrial cleaning supplies into his cart while reviewing the final elements of their intervention strategy. His daughter Emma's latest medical reports from Geneva showed continued improvement, a blessing that made his current situation even more agonizing. The stable employment that enabled him to contribute to her care was about to be sacrificed for principles that might seem abstract to a 7-year-old who only understood that Daddy worked hard to help her feel better. The irony was not lost on Marcus that his expertise in forensic accounting, the career he had abandoned to support his family, had become the instrument through which he might lose the income that sustained them. Yet the evidence he had uncovered left no room for moral ambiguity. The Hartwell Industries merger was not simply a bad business decision, but a criminal enterprise that would facilitate money laundering, drug trafficking, and human trafficking on an unprecedented scale. His professional training and personal ethics demanded action regardless of the personal cost. Their plan was elegantly simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. Victoria would present the forensic evidence to the board during the emergency meeting, while Marcus would simultaneously deliver copies to the FBI, field office downtown, and the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division. The timing was crucial because their investigation had revealed that several board members had financial interests in the merger's completion and would likely attempt to suppress any evidence that threatened the transaction. The coordination required split-second timing across multiple locations. Victoria needed to begin her presentation at exactly 9:15, the moment when Marcus would arrive at the FBI field office with documented proof of the money laundering conspiracy. If either component of their plan failed or was delayed, the other would be exposed to retaliation before law enforcement could provide protection. They had rehearsed the sequence dozens of times during their covert meetings, but the reality of execution carried risks that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. Marcus had spent the previous evening creating multiple copies of their evidence, storing documents in safety deposit boxes across 3 different banks and mailing additional copies to investigative journalists at major newspapers. The redundancy was necessary because their investigation had revealed the extent to which the criminal organization had infiltrated law enforcement and regulatory agencies. They could not assume that a single report to the FBI would trigger appropriate action, particularly given the political pressure that $12 billion could generate within the federal bureaucracy. Victoria's preparation had been more psychologically demanding. She had drafted her resignation letter, knowing that her career as a corporate executive would likely end regardless of whether their intervention succeeded. The board members who were complicit in the conspiracy would certainly demand her removal, while those who were innocent would blame her for the chaos that would follow the merger's collapse. Her reputation as a transformational leader would be replaced by notoriety as the CEO who destroyed a major acquisition through what her critics would characterize as paranoid delusions. The personal cost extended beyond her professional life. Victoria had built her identity around corporate success, measuring her worth through shareholder returns and market position, rather than the human relationships she had sacrificed along the way. The prospect of losing the career that had defined her for 2 decades forced her to confront Fundamental questions about purpose and meaning that she had avoided through decades of relentless ambition. Marcus had become not only her investigative partner but also the first person in years who valued her for qualities unrelated to her corporate achievements. Their relationship had deepened through shared danger in ways that neither had anticipated. The clandestine nature of their collaboration had created an intimacy born of absolute trust and mutual dependence. Victoria found herself sharing fears and vulnerabilities that she had never revealed to romantic partners, while Marcus discovered intellectual stimulation and professional respect that had been absent from his life since leaving forensic accounting. The partnership transcended their disparate backgrounds and circumstances, creating a bond that neither fully understood but both desperately needed. The evening before the board meeting, they met for what might be their final collaboration in the executive conference room where their investigation had begun. The space had been transformed from a symbol of corporate power into a war room where two unlikely allies had planned their assault on a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American business and politics. The mahogany table was covered with documents, photographs, and financial analysis that represented months of covert investigation and personal risk. Marcus reviewed his timeline for approaching federal authorities, while Victoria finalized her presentation to the board. Her slides were masterpieces of concise communication, distilling complex financial fraud into visual representations that even non-experts could understand immediately. The evidence was overwhelming, but Victoria knew that logic and facts would compete against financial incentives and political pressure that had already corrupted much of Sterling's leadership structure. Their conversation that evening revealed depths of character that neither had previously shown to anyone. Victoria spoke about her childhood in Queens, her parents' sacrifices, and the gradual transformation that had turned her into someone she barely recognized. The acquisition of wealth and power had come at the cost of connections to family, friends, and community that she was only now beginning to understand she had lost. Her partnership with Marcus had reminded her of values and priorities that her corporate success had obscured. Marcus shared his own journey from academic achievement through professional success to the devastating choices that had reshaped his life. His decision to prioritize his daughter's health over his career had seemed obvious at the time, but the psychological impact of abandoning his professional identity had been more difficult than he had anticipated. His collaboration with Victoria had restored his sense of purpose and demonstrated that his expertise remained valuable even in his current circumstances. The intimacy of their conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone vibrating with an international call. Sarah's voice from Geneva carried news that would test their resolve in ways neither had imagined. Emma's latest blood work had revealed complications that required immediate intervention, expensive experimental treatments that were not covered by any insurance plan. The medical bills would exceed Marcus's annual salary by a factor of 3, making his employment situation more critical than ever before. Victoria listened to Marcus's side of the conversation with growing alarm as the scope of Emma's medical crisis became apparent. The timing was catastrophic, arriving precisely when Marcus was about to sacrifice his job for principles that would provide no compensation for his family's financial needs. Sarah's voice carried the controlled panic of a mother watching her child's condition deteriorate while calculating costs that seemed insurmountable given their current resources. When Marcus ended the call, his face showed the devastating conflict between paternal duty and ethical obligation that no parent should have to navigate. The evidence they had compiled could save thousands of jobs and prevent a massive crime, but acting on that evidence would eliminate his ability to contribute to Emma's medical care at the moment when she needed it most. The cruel irony was that his forensic expertise, which had uncovered the conspiracy, was also the skill set that could command the consulting fees necessary to fund his daughter's treatment. Victoria's response surprised them both. Without hesitation, she offered to cover Emma's medical expenses regardless of what happened with their investigation. Her personal wealth, accumulated through years of corporate success, could easily absorb costs that would bankrupt Marcus's family. The offer was made not as charity, but as investment in a partnership that had become more important to her than any business relationship she had ever maintained. Marcus's initial reaction was to decline the offer, his pride recoiling from accepting financial assistance that he could not repay. But Victoria's explanation transcended simple generosity. She described her wealth as an accident of circumstance and corporate positioning rather than personal achievement, accumulated through participation in systems that she was now working to expose and reform. Supporting Emma's medical care was not charity, but rather a form of restitution for the inequities that had shaped both their lives. The conversation that followed forced both to confront the relationship that had developed between them during their investigation. What had begun as professional collaboration had evolved into personal partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and complementary strengths that neither possessed alone. Victoria's business acumen and Marcus's forensic expertise had proven synergistic, but their personal connection transcended professional utility to encompass emotional support and intellectual companionship that both had been missing from their lives. Victoria's offer to support Emma's medical care removed the financial pressure that might have compromised Marcus's ethical judgment, but it also created emotional obligations that complicated their professional partnership. The boundaries between business collaboration and personal relationship became blurred in ways that neither had anticipated when their investigation began. Their mutual dependence had evolved beyond strategic necessity to encompass emotional needs that both were reluctant to acknowledge explicitly. The depth of their connection became apparent when Victoria revealed that she had already contacted specialists in pediatric immunology to ensure that Emma would receive the best possible care, regardless of financial constraints. Her investigation into treatment options had been conducted with the same thoroughness she applied to business analysis, identifying resources and expertise that might not be available through conventional channels. The gesture demonstrated not only financial generosity, but also personal investment in Marcus's family welfare that transcended professional partnership. Marcus found himself overwhelmed by Victoria's generosity and the implications of accepting assistance that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic in their relationship. His independence had been crucial to maintaining the objectivity necessary for forensic analysis, but accepting financial support would create obligations that might compromise his professional judgment. Yet Emma's medical needs left no room for pride or theoretical concerns about professional ethics when his daughter's life was at stake. Their discussion was interrupted by Marcus's phone ringing again, this time with a call from the night security supervisor at Sterling Dynamics. The conversation was brief but alarming. Someone had attempted to access the executive floor after hours, triggering security protocols that had been enhanced following recent concerns about corporate espionage. The intruder had fled before security could arrive, but surveillance footage showed an individual who appeared to be conducting systematic searches of executive offices. The timing of the security breach was too coincidental to ignore. Their investigation had been conducted with elaborate precautions to avoid detection, but the attempted break-in suggested that their activities had been discovered by someone with resources and motivation to gather intelligence about their plans. The criminal organization behind the Hartwell Industries merger had demonstrated sophisticated capabilities in corrupting corporate executives and regulatory officials, making their surveillance and infiltration of Sterling Dynamics entirely plausible. Victoria's immediate concern was for the encrypted flash drives containing their evidence, currently stored in her penthouse apartment and several safety deposit boxes around the city. If their investigation had been compromised, those storage locations might also be known to their adversaries. The prospect of losing their evidence on the eve of their planned intervention created urgency that transcended their personal safety. Concerns. Marcus's forensic training had prepared him for situations where investigations attracted attention from subjects who possessed resources to interfere with evidence collection and analysis. His recommendation was to assume that their activities were being monitored and to implement additional security measures that would protect both their evidence and their personal safety. The criminal organization's willingness to infiltrate. Sterling Dynamics suggested capabilities that extended far beyond simple corporate corruption. Their contingency planning session lasted until dawn, as they developed protocols for protecting their evidence while ensuring that their intervention could proceed even if one or both of them were prevented from participating. The redundancy they had built into their documentation storage proved prescient, as the threat of evidence destruction became immediate rather than theoretical. Their multiple copies stored in different locations would ensure that the investigation could continue even if their primary evidence was compromised. The personal dimension of their partnership became even more significant as they faced threats that extended beyond professional consequences to encompass physical danger. Victoria had never experienced fear for her personal safety in connection with business activities, while Marcus's forensic accounting career had occasionally involved subjects who preferred intimidation to legal defense. Their collaboration had exposed them both to risks that neither could face alone, creating mutual dependence that transcended professional necessity. As Tuesday morning arrived and the board meeting approached, Victoria and Marcus found themselves bound together not only by shared knowledge and common purpose but also by personal commitments that had evolved throughout their investigation. Victoria's promise to support Emma's medical care had removed financial pressure from Marcus's decision-making, while Marcus's expertise and partnership had provided Victoria with the intellectual and emotional support necessary to challenge a conspiracy that threatened everything she had built. Their final preparation took place in Victoria's office as dawn broke over Manhattan, the city awakening to what would become one of the most significant days in Sterling Dynamics' corporate history. The evidence they had compiled filled bankers' boxes that lined the walls, representing months of analysis that had revealed corruption reaching the highest levels of American business and politics. Their investigation had uncovered not only the specific crimes related to the Hartwell Industries merger, but also systematic vulnerabilities in corporate governance that enabled money laundering and other criminal activities throughout the financial system. The morning news carried reports of unusual trading activity in Sterling Dynamics stock, suggesting that information about the board meeting had leaked to investors who were positioning themselves for significant price movements. The volume and timing of the trades indicated sophisticated knowledge of corporate events that should have been confidential, providing additional evidence that their investigation had been discovered by individuals with access to insider information and financial resources to exploit that knowledge. Victoria's final review of her presentation confirmed that their evidence was comprehensive, compelling, and properly documented according to legal standards that would enable federal prosecution of the individuals involved in the conspiracy. Marcus's forensic analysis had identified specific violations of securities law, banking regulations, and anti-money laundering statutes that carried severe criminal penalties. Their collaboration had produced not only the evidence necessary to prevent the merger, but also the foundation for criminal cases that could dismantle the international money laundering network that Hartwell Industries had been designed to facilitate. As the hour of confrontation approached, Victoria and Marcus understood that their partnership had achieved objectives that neither could have accomplished alone. Their investigation had revealed crimes that threatened not only Sterling Dynamics, but also the integrity of the American financial system, while their personal relationship had provided the mutual support necessary to sustain their efforts despite enormous pressure and personal risk. The janitor and the CEO, who had met by chance in a corporate conference room, were about to challenge powerful interests that would stop at nothing to protect their criminal enterprise, armed with evidence that could change the course of corporate history and international law enforcement. The Sterling Dynamics boardroom had never felt smaller than it did at 9:14 on Tuesday morning, as Victoria Sterling stood before 14 of the most powerful executives in American finance while Marcus Thompson walked through the metal detectors at the FBI field office 6 blocks away. The mahogany paneling that had witnessed countless strategic decisions now seemed to close in around her like the walls of a confessional, where she was about to reveal sins that would destroy careers and reshape the corporate landscape forever. Board Chairman Harrison Blackwood adjusted his platinum cufflinks and checked his Patek Philippe watch with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to controlling billion-dollar decisions through subtle intimidation and strategic silence. His steel-gray eyes had been assessing Victoria with predatory patience since she announced that the merger vote would be preceded by crucial new information that demanded immediate attention. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, sensing tension they could not yet comprehend, but instinctively recognizing as threatening to their comfortable world of quarterly profits and executive compensation packages. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she activated the presentation system, knowing that the next 30 minutes would either save Sterling Dynamics from criminal infiltration or destroy her career in a spectacular public explosion that would dominate financial headlines for months. The encrypted flash drive containing months of forensic analysis felt impossibly heavy in her jacket pocket, while her phone buzzed silently with updates from Marcus as he navigated federal bureaucracy that moved with glacial indifference to the urgency of their situation. The first slide that appeared on the conference room's wall-mounted screens showed the proposed merger structure in deceptively simple terms that concealed the complexity of the criminal enterprise they had uncovered. Victoria began speaking in the measured tone she had perfected during hundreds of investor presentations, but her voice carried undertones of moral conviction that her audience had never heard before. She explained that routine due diligence had revealed irregularities requiring board attention before any voting could proceed, carefully avoiding specifics that might trigger premature interruption from board members whose financial interests she was about to expose. Harrison Blackwood's expression shifted from mild impatience to sharp attention as Victoria's presentation progressed beyond routine corporate formalities into territory that threatened his carefully constructed financial arrangements. His real estate investments in Southeast Asia were intimately connected to entities that laundered proceeds for the criminal organizations behind Hartwell Industries, while his consulting agreements with offshore firms provided millions in annual income that would disappear if the merger collapsed. The forensic evidence that Victoria was methodically presenting threatened not only his personal wealth, but also his freedom, as federal prosecutors would inevitably discover his role in facilitating money laundering operations. The other board members began recognizing the implications of Victoria's presentation with varying degrees of alarm and comprehension. Chief Financial Officer Margaret Henley had suspected irregularities in Hartwell's financial statements, but had chosen to ignore warning signs that might complicate a transaction that would substantially increase her performance bonuses. Technology. Director James Morrison had accepted speaking fees from entities that Marcus's analysis had identified as money laundering vehicles, creating conflicts of interest that he had failed to disclose to his fellow board members. Victoria's presentation reached its devastating climax as she displayed organizational charts that revealed the true ownership structure of Hartwell Industries, showing connections to sanctioned individuals and criminal enterprises that federal law enforcement had been tracking for years. The evidence was presented with forensic precision that left no room for misinterpretation or rationalization, demonstrating systematic deception that had corrupted Sterling's due diligence process through bribery, intimidation, and regulatory capture. The silence that followed Victoria's final slide was broken by Harrison Blackwood's carefully modulated voice, carrying tones of disappointment and paternal concern that masked his desperate calculation of options for damage control. He expressed appreciation for Victoria's diligence, while questioning the reliability of analysis, conducted without proper legal and financial expertise, subtly undermining her credibility while buying time to formulate a response that would neutralize the threat she represented to his criminal enterprise. Margaret Henley's response was more direct, questioning Victoria's motives for conducting unauthorized investigations that violated corporate protocols and potentially exposed Sterling Dynamics to legal liability. Her aggressive tone reflected not only professional disagreement, but also personal panic as she realized that her complicity in ignoring obvious warning signs would be exposed if Victoria's evidence received serious consideration from law enforcement or regulatory agencies. The boardroom erupted into heated discussion as members aligned themselves according to their financial interests and criminal exposure, rather than their fiduciary duties to Sterling's shareholders. Those who had profited from relationships with Hartwell-connected entities argued for proceeding with the merger despite Victoria's concerns, while the few board members without such conflicts demanded thorough investigation of the evidence she had presented. Victoria found herself isolated in a room full of people she had worked with for years, realizing that the corporate culture she had helped create had been systematically corrupted by individuals who viewed board service as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than oversight responsibility. Her moral authority as CEO was being challenged by executives whose ethical standards had been compromised through relationships that she was now exposing to legal scrutiny. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson sat in a sterile government office building, explaining the complexities of international money laundering to FBI Special Agent Patricia Williams, whose 20-year career in financial crimes had prepared her for sophisticated criminal enterprises but not for whistleblowers, who arrived with evidence more comprehensive than most multi-year federal investigations. The banker's boxes of documents that Marcus had assembled presented a level of detail and analysis that typically required teams of forensic accountants, working with federal resources rather than a single individual operating under clandestine circumstances. Agent Williams reviewed Marcus's credentials with growing amazement as she realized that his forensic expertise exceeded that of most federal investigators, while his access to Sterling Dynamics' internal information had enabled discovery of criminal activities that traditional law enforcement surveillance had missed entirely. His analysis of financial records revealed money laundering techniques that federal agencies had not previously encountered, suggesting sophistication that transcended typical corporate fraud to encompass national security implications. The evidence that Marcus presented went far beyond the immediate Hartwell Industries merger to reveal systematic vulnerabilities in corporate governance that enabled criminal organizations to infiltrate American financial institutions through corruption rather than force. His documentation showed how regulatory capture and executive bribery could be coordinated across multiple agencies and corporations to create legitimate facades for illegal activities that generated billions in criminal proceeds annually. Agent Williams understood immediately that Marcus's evidence required coordination with multiple federal agencies, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and the Department of Justice's Organized Crime and Racketeering Section. The international scope of the money laundering network demanded cooperation with law enforcement agencies throughout Asia and Europe, creating jurisdictional complexities that could delay intervention beyond the merger deadline that was rapidly approaching. Back in the Sterling Dynamics boardroom, Harrison Blackwood had regained control of the discussion through parliamentary procedures that marginalized Victoria's evidence while focusing attention on her alleged violations of corporate protocol. His motion to table consideration of her presentation pending legal review by outside counsel was designed to delay any action until after the merger vote, when the criminal enterprise would be protected by the completed transaction's complexity and international scope. Victoria's attempts to explain the urgency of immediate action were met with legalistic objections that revealed how thoroughly the board's decision-making process had been corrupted by members whose personal interests conflicted with their fiduciary duties, the very executives who should have been demanding investigation of potential fraud were instead working to suppress evidence that threatened their financial arrangements with criminal organizations. The corporate governance system that was supposed to provide checks and balances against executive misconduct had been systematically undermined by individuals who viewed board positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than oversight. Responsibilities. Victoria found herself confronting not merely a fraudulent merger, but a fundamental corruption of the institutional structures that were supposed to protect shareholders and stakeholders from criminal infiltration of legitimate business operations. Margaret Henley's motion to censure Victoria for conducting unauthorized investigations gained support from board members, whose own criminal exposure made them desperate to discredit the evidence she had presented. The parliamentary maneuvering that followed revealed the extent to which Sterling's governance had been captured by interests that prioritized personal profit over corporate integrity or legal compliance. Victoria's isolation in the boardroom was compounded by her growing concern about Marcus's safety as he navigated federal bureaucracy that might not respond quickly enough to prevent retaliation by criminal organizations with extensive resources and motivation to eliminate threats to their operations. Her phone remained silent as she had requested, but the lack of communication created anxiety about whether Marcus had successfully delivered their evidence or encountered obstacles that had prevented him from reaching appropriate authorities. The discussion in the boardroom reached a crescendo when Harrison Blackwood accused Victoria of manufacturing evidence to serve personal ambitions that conflicted with Sterling's strategic interests. His attack was carefully crafted to exploit gender stereotypes in corporate politics that portrayed ambitious female executives as emotionally unstable and professionally unreliable, particularly when their judgment conflicted with male colleagues' business assessments. Victoria's response drew upon reserves of moral courage that had been dormant throughout her corporate career, as she abandoned the diplomatic language of executive communication in favor of direct confrontation with colleagues whose criminal behavior threatened not only Sterling dynamics, but also the integrity of American financial markets. Her detailed recitation of evidence that implicated specific board members in money laundering activities created an atmosphere of barely controlled panic among those whose criminal exposure was greatest. The boardroom atmosphere became increasingly hostile as members realized that Victoria's evidence could trigger federal investigations that would expose years of systematic corruption throughout Sterling's leadership structure. The comfortable world of corporate privilege and executive compensation was being threatened by moral principles that most had abandoned in pursuit of personal wealth and social status. James Morrison's attempt to characterize Victoria's investigation as a psychological breakdown reflected the desperation of executives who had bet their careers and freedom on a criminal enterprise that was now threatened by someone they had underestimated and marginalized. His suggestion that she seek psychiatric evaluation was designed to discredit her evidence while creating legal justification for removing her from corporate leadership before she could cause further damage to their financial arrangements. Victoria's phone finally buzzed with a text message from Marcus, confirming that he had successfully delivered their evidence to federal authorities, but also warning that surveillance footage from Sterling Dynamics had revealed their clandestine meetings to individuals who were now actively seeking to neutralize the threat they represented. The personal danger that both faced had escalated beyond professional consequences to encompass physical safety concerns that neither had fully anticipated when their investigation began. The boardroom confrontation reached its climax when Harrison Blackwood called for an immediate vote to remove Victoria from her position as CEO, claiming that her recent behavior demonstrated unfitness for executive responsibility and posed unacceptable risks to Sterling's shareholders and stakeholders. The motion required only a simple majority of board members, many of whom had compelling personal reasons to eliminate the threat that Victoria's evidence represented to their criminal activities. Victoria's final appeal to the board emphasized not only the legal obligations they faced as fiduciaries, but also the moral responsibilities they bore to the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on Sterling's continued operation as a legitimate business enterprise rather than a vehicle for international money laundering. Her passionate defense of corporate integrity stood in stark contrast to the calculating self-interest that had corrupted her colleagues' judgment and ethical standards. The vote that followed revealed the complete capture of Sterling's governance by criminal interests, as 10 of 14 board members supported Victoria's removal despite evidence that their decision would facilitate ongoing money laundering activities and expose the company to massive legal liability. The corporate democracy that was supposed to provide accountability and oversight had been systematically subverted by individuals whose personal financial interests trumped their legal and ethical obligations. Margaret Henley's elevation to interim CEO position was approved immediately, ensuring that the Hartwell Industries merger would proceed despite the overwhelming evidence of fraud and criminal infiltration that Victoria had presented. The new leadership's first official action was to authorize legal proceedings against Victoria for breach of fiduciary duty and corporate espionage, creating additional obstacles to her cooperation with federal investigators who would need her testimony to build criminal cases against the perpetrators. Victoria's expulsion from the boardroom was accompanied by security personnel who had been positioned outside the conference room in anticipation of her removal, suggesting that her colleagues had planned to eliminate her regardless of the evidence she presented. The corporate headquarters that had been her professional home for over a decade had become enemy territory where her physical safety could not be guaranteed and her access to additional evidence was permanently severed. As Victoria was escorted from Sterling Dynamics for the final time, she understood that her corporate career had ended not through business failure or strategic miscalculation, but through moral courage that had placed her in conflict with a criminal conspiracy that controlled the institution she had devoted her life to building. The personal cost of her ethical stance would extend far beyond lost income and professional reputation to encompass ongoing danger from criminal organizations with international reach and unlimited resources. Her partnership with Marcus Thompson had evolved from professional collaboration to personal alliance that transcended their disparate backgrounds and circumstances, creating a bond forged through shared danger and common purpose that neither had expected to find in their unlikely circumstances. The janitor and the CEO, who had discovered each other through chance, had become partners in a struggle against corruption that would test not only their investigative skills, but also their courage in confronting enemies whose power extended throughout the highest levels of corporate and political leadership. The immediate future held uncertainty and danger that neither could fully anticipate, but their collaboration had already achieved objectives that seemed impossible when their investigation began. The evidence they had compiled would enable federal prosecutors to dismantle an international money laundering network, while their personal partnership had demonstrated that moral courage could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances to challenge corruption that seemed invincible. The battle they had begun in corporate conference rooms and government offices would continue in courtrooms and congressional hearings that would reshape American corporate governance and international law enforcement cooperation for years to come. 6 months after the FBI raids that dismantled the largest corporate money laundering operation in American history, Victoria Sterling sat in a congressional hearing room watching Harrison Blackwood invoke his Fifth Amendment rights for the 47th time. The former Sterling Dynamics board chairman's orange jumpsuit contrasted sharply with the tailored suits he had worn while orchestrating criminal enterprises from corporate boardrooms, his arrogance replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed under the weight of federal indictments spanning 3 continents. The House Financial Services Committee hearing represented the culmination of investigations that had revealed corruption reaching the highest levels of American business and government, exposing systematic failures in corporate governance that enabled international criminal organizations to infiltrate legitimate financial institutions through bribery and regulatory capture. Victoria's testimony had provided the foundation for prosecutions that resulted in over 200 federal indictments and the recovery of more than $8 billion in laundered criminal proceeds. Marcus Thompson watched the proceedings from the gallery, his forensic expertise having earned him a position as senior consultant to the Justice Department's Corporate Crime Task Force. His analysis of financial records had become the gold standard for detecting sophisticated money laundering schemes, while his testimony in federal court had helped convict executives whose crimes had threatened the integrity of the entire American financial system. The consulting fees from his government work had easily covered Emma's medical expenses while providing the intellectual stimulation that his previous career had offered. Emma's recovery had exceeded all medical predictions, her immune system responding to experimental treatments with remarkable success that allowed her to return from Geneva to live with Marcus in their new apartment overlooking Central Park. Sarah had accepted a permanent research position in Switzerland, their marriage having ended amicably as they recognized that their paths had diverged irrevocably during their time apart. The custody arrangement they developed allowed Emma to spend summers in Geneva, while maintaining her primary residence in New York, where Marcus's work with federal investigators provided stability and purpose that complemented his role as a single father. Victoria's transition from corporate executive to whistleblower advocate had been more challenging but ultimately more fulfilling than anything she had achieved during her business career. The sterling foundation for corporate integrity, funded by her personal wealth and federal whistleblower awards, provided legal support and financial assistance to employees who discovered criminal activities within their organizations. Her testimony before Congress had led to legislation strengthening corporate governance requirements and expanding protection for whistleblowers who exposed criminal activities at personal risk. The relationship between Victoria and Marcus had evolved beyond their initial partnership in investigation and law enforcement cooperation to encompass personal friendship and intellectual collaboration that enriched both their lives. Their shared experience of confronting corruption had created bonds that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances, while their complementary skills in business strategy and forensic analysis made them effective advocates for corporate accountability and government transparency. The congressional hearing where Harrison Blackwood refused to testify was part of broader legislative efforts to reform corporate governance and strengthen penalties for executives who facilitated criminal activities through their fiduciary positions. Victoria's written testimony detailed the systematic failures that had enabled the Hartwell Industries conspiracy, while recommending specific changes to securities, law, and banking regulations that would prevent similar criminal infiltration of legitimate business operations. Margaret Henley's suicide in federal custody had shocked the financial community, but illustrated the desperate measures that corrupt executives would take to avoid accountability for their criminal activities. Her death had eliminated a key witness in prosecutions of other conspirators, but the documentary evidence that Victoria and Marcus had compiled provided sufficient proof for convictions that resulted in sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years in federal prison. The international scope of the money laundering network had required unprecedented cooperation between American law enforcement agencies and their counterparts throughout Asia and Europe, resulting in coordinated arrests and asset seizures that disrupted criminal organizations responsible for drug trafficking, arms dealing, and human trafficking across multiple continents. The diplomatic implications of the investigation had strengthened relationships between democratic governments, while exposing authoritarian regimes that had facilitated money laundering through corrupt banking systems. Sterling Dynamics had emerged from the scandal as a transformed corporation under new leadership that prioritized ethical business practices and transparent governance over short-term profit maximization. The employee stock ownership plan that Victoria had proposed before her removal had been implemented by the new management team, creating financial incentives for workers to monitor corporate behavior and report irregularities that might indicate criminal infiltration of business operations. The personal cost of their whistleblowing activities had been substantial but manageable through the support systems they had developed during their investigation and its aftermath. Victoria's ostracism from traditional corporate circles had been offset by recognition from academic institutions, government agencies, and advocacy organizations that valued her expertise in detecting and preventing corporate crime. Her consulting work with federal prosecutors had provided income that supplemented her foundation activities, while keeping her engaged with the investigative work that had become her passion. Marcus's transformation from custodial worker to federal consultant had required extensive retraining in contemporary forensic accounting techniques and federal law enforcement procedures, but his fundamental analytical skills had proven adaptable to new technologies and regulatory frameworks. His work with the Justice Department had exposed him to criminal enterprises far more sophisticated than the corporate fraud cases that had characterized his previous career, expanding his expertise while contributing to national security objectives that extended beyond traditional financial crimes. The adoption proceedings that would make Victoria Emma's legal guardian had been complicated by the international custody arrangements and Marcus's concerns about exposing his daughter to the ongoing dangers associated with their high-profile role in federal prosecutions. The security measures that protected both Victoria and Marcus from retaliation by criminal organizations they had helped prosecute extended to Emma's school and extracurricular activities, creating logistical challenges that required careful coordination with federal marshals and private security firms. Victoria's relationship with Emma had developed naturally through shared interests in art and science that provided intellectual stimulation for a gifted child whose medical experiences had accelerated her emotional maturity beyond her chronological age. The private school that Emma attended in Manhattan offered specialized programs for children with health challenges while maintaining the academic standards necessary for her continued intellectual development. The legal proceedings that would formally recognize Victoria as Emma's adoptive mother represented more than bureaucratic formality to all three members of their unconventional family. The paperwork that documented their relationships could not capture the emotional bonds that had developed through shared adversity and mutual support during the most challenging period of their lives. Emma's acceptance of Victoria as a parental figure had been gradual but genuine, based on demonstrated commitment rather than biological connection. Marcus's romantic feelings for Victoria had developed slowly and carefully, constrained by their professional partnership and the complexities of their family situation. Their relationship had been built on intellectual compatibility and shared values rather than physical attraction, creating a foundation for partnership that could withstand the pressures of public scrutiny and ongoing legal proceedings. The guilty engagement ring that Marcus had designed incorporated elements representing all three members of their family, including a sapphire from Switzerland that Emma had chosen to represent her mother Sarah's continuing role in her life. The wedding ceremony that united Victoria and Marcus took place in the federal courthouse, where their testimony had helped convict dozens of corporate criminals, officiated by the judge who had sentenced Harrison Blackwood to 40 years in federal prison. The guest list included FBI agents, federal prosecutors, congressional staff members, and advocacy organization leaders whose work had been supported by the Sterling Foundation for Corporate Integrity. Emma's role as maid of honor reflected her central importance to the family that Victoria and Marcus had created through their partnership in investigation and their shared commitment to corporate accountability and social justice. Her toast at the reception celebrated not only their marriage, but also their success in proving that ordinary people could challenge powerful interests and prevail through courage, intelligence, and mutual support. The honeymoon that Victoria, Marcus, and Emma took to Geneva allowed them to visit Sarah and express gratitude for her support during the medical crisis that had tested their family's resilience and strengthened their bonds. The experimental treatments that had saved Emma's life continued under Sarah's supervision, but the child's robust health allowed for international travel and normal childhood activities that had seemed impossible during the darkest period of her illness. The Sterling Dynamics headquarters building that had once symbolized corporate power and executive privilege had been renamed the Public Integrity Center, housing nonprofit organizations dedicated to corporate accountability, government transparency, and whistleblower protection. Victoria's former office on the 38th floor served as a meeting space for advocacy groups whose work continued the mission that she and Marcus had begun through their investigation of the Hartwell Industries merger. The annual conference on corporate crime prevention that Victoria organized brought together law enforcement officials, academic researchers, business leaders, and advocacy organization representatives to share information about emerging threats and effective countermeasures. Marcus's presentations on forensic accounting techniques had become highlights of the program, while Emma's artwork decorated the conference materials with images that celebrated integrity and courage in the face of institutional corruption. The book that Victoria and Marcus co-authored about their investigation had become required reading in business schools and law enforcement academies throughout the United States and Europe, providing case study material that illustrated both the techniques used by sophisticated criminal organizations and the methods available to detect and prosecute their activities. The royalties from their book funded scholarships for students pursuing careers in forensic accounting and corporate law enforcement. The congressional legislation that emerged from their testimony had strengthened whistleblower protections, while increasing penalties for corporate executives who facilitated criminal activities through their fiduciary positions. The Corporate Accountability Act had passed with bipartisan support after dramatic hearings that featured Victoria's detailed testimony about the systematic corruption she had encountered at Sterling Dynamics and Marcus's expert analysis of the financial techniques used to conceal criminal activities. The international banking reforms that resulted from their investigation had closed regulatory loopholes that enabled money laundering while establishing new cooperation mechanisms between law enforcement agencies in different countries. The diplomatic protocols they had helped develop provided frameworks for coordinating investigations of transnational criminal organizations whose activities transcended traditional jurisdictional boundaries. The personal satisfaction that Victoria and Marcus derived from their transformation of corporate scandal into systemic reform exceeded anything they had achieved during their previous careers. Their partnership had demonstrated that individual courage and expertise could challenge institutional corruption while creating positive change that protected countless innocent people from criminal exploitation. The family they had created through adversity had become a symbol of hope for others who faced similar challenges in exposing wrongdoing at personal risk. The future that stretched before them held opportunities for continued service in corporate accountability and government transparency that would build upon the foundation they had established through their investigation and advocacy work. Emma's interest in forensic science and social justice suggested that the next generation would continue their mission with enhanced tools and expanded opportunities for preventing corporate crime and protecting vulnerable populations from institutional exploitation. Their story had begun with a chance encounter between a stressed executive and a knowledgeable janitor in a corporate conference room, but it had evolved into a partnership that reshaped American corporate governance while demonstrating the power of ordinary people to challenge extraordinary corruption through courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice. The university auditorium fell silent as Emma Thompson Sterling stepped to the podium, her graduation cap slightly askew and her doctorate diploma still warm from the dean's handshake. At 24, she had become the youngest person ever to receive a PhD in forensic economics from Columbia University. Her dissertation on algorithmic detection of corporate money laundering networks, already cited by federal agencies implementing new surveillance technologies. The audience of family, faculty, and law enforcement officials represented a community that had watched her grow from a sick child, whose medical bills had changed her father's life into a scholar whose work would protect millions from financial exploitation. Marcus Thompson sat in the front row, his hair now silver at the temples, but his eyes bright with pride as he watched his daughter deliver the valedictory address that would launch her into a career combining her parents' expertise in forensic analysis and corporate accountability. 17 years had passed since the night he had met Victoria Sterling while cleaning windows on the 38th floor, but the partnership that had begun in that corporate conference room continued to influence policy and practice throughout the international financial system. Victoria Sterling Thompson occupied the chair beside her husband, her appearance softened by time, but her reputation enhanced by decades of advocacy work that had transformed corporate governance and whistleblower protection throughout the democratic world. The Sterling Thompson Institute for Financial Integrity, housed in the building that had once served as Sterling Dynamics headquarters, employed over 300 researchers whose work had prevented countless crimes, while recovering billions in stolen assets for victims of corporate fraud. Emma's speech traced the evolution of financial crime, from the crude schemes of previous decades to the sophisticated, artificial intelligence networks that contemporary criminals use to exploit vulnerabilities in global banking systems. Her research had identified patterns invisible to traditional analysis, developing machine learning algorithms that could detect money laundering activities across multiple jurisdictions and currencies with unprecedented accuracy and speed. The personal journey that had brought Emma to this moment began with the medical crisis that had separated her from Marcus during her childhood, but it had been shaped by the values and principles that Victoria and Marcus had demonstrated through their investigation of the Hartwell Industries conspiracy. Her earliest memories included conversations about corporate responsibility and ethical decision-making that had influenced her academic choices and career aspirations long before she understood their full significance. Dr. Sarah Chun Thompson watched her daughter's triumph via livestream from her laboratory in Geneva, where her research into pediatric immunology had led to treatments that saved thousands of children worldwide. The divorce that had ended her marriage to Marcus had been followed by friendship and collaboration that enabled Emma to maintain relationships with both parents while pursuing her own path in academia and public service. The audience included FBI Director Amanda Rodriguez, whose career had been launched by her successful prosecution of the Sterling Dynamics case, and Treasury Secretary Michael Park, whose regulatory reforms had been based on recommendations that Victoria and Marcus had developed through their advocacy work. The presence of such high-ranking officials reflected the continuing influence of the corporate accountability movement that had emerged from their investigation. Emma's research presentation described algorithmic techniques that could identify suspicious financial patterns in real time, enabling law enforcement agencies to intervene before criminal enterprises could complete their money laundering operations. Her work had already been implemented by banking regulators in 12 countries, resulting in the seizure of over $4 billion in criminal proceeds during the previous year alone. The technology that Emma had developed represented a quantum leap beyond the manual analysis techniques that Marcus had used to uncover the Hartwell Industries conspiracy, but it was built upon the same fundamental principles of pattern recognition and systematic investigation that had characterized his forensic accounting career. Her algorithms could process financial data from thousands of sources simultaneously, identifying relationships and anomalies that would require teams of human analysts months to discover. Victoria's introduction of Emma's presentation emphasized the generational progression from individual heroism to institutional reform that had characterized their family's contribution to corporate accountability. The courage that she and Marcus had shown in confronting criminal corruption had created opportunities for their daughter to develop tools that would prevent similar crimes on a global scale. The academic recognition that Emma received was accompanied by offers from technology companies seeking to commercialize her research, but she had already committed to working with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to implement her algorithms in developing countries where weak regulatory systems made them particularly vulnerable to money laundering operations. Her decision to prioritize public service over private profit reflected values that Victoria and Marcus had instilled through example rather than instruction. The celebration that followed Emma's graduation included colleagues from academia, government, and non-profit organizations whose work had been influenced by the Sterling Thompson family's contributions to corporate accountability and financial transparency. The diversity of the gathering reflected the international scope of their influence and the interdisciplinary nature of contemporary efforts to combat sophisticated financial crimes. Marcus's toast to his daughter acknowledged the sacrifices that had shaped their family's journey, from his decision to leave forensic accounting to support her medical care through Victoria's choice to sacrifice her corporate career to expose criminal corruption. He emphasized that Emma's achievements represented not only personal success, but also vindication of their belief that individual integrity could create positive change despite institutional resistance. Victoria's remarks focused on the future challenges that Emma's generation would face as criminal organizations adapted to new technologies and regulatory frameworks. She emphasized that the tools Emma had developed were only as effective as the institutions that implemented them, and the individuals who operated them with integrity and commitment to justice. The private gathering that followed the public celebration took place in the penthouse apartment where Victoria and Marcus had planned their intervention in the Hartwell Industries merger, the space now converted into a family home that reflected their shared values and continuing commitment to corporate accountability. The walls displayed Emma's childhood artwork alongside photographs documenting their family's growth and the professional recognition they had received for their contributions to financial integrity. Emma's plans for her post-graduation fellowship included establishing research partnerships with universities in Africa and Latin America, where her algorithmic detection systems could be adapted to local financial systems and regulatory frameworks. Her goal was to create a global network of academic institutions capable of identifying and preventing money laundering operations before they could establish footholds in developing economies. The mentorship relationships that Emma had developed during her graduate studies included connections with the next generation of researchers whose work would build upon her algorithmic innovations. Her thesis advisor, Professor Janet Liu, had been recruited from the Federal Reserve Supervision Division specifically to develop academic programs that would train future specialists in financial crime detection and prevention. The book that Emma was writing about her research included chapters co-authored with Victoria and Marcus, creating a multi-generational perspective on the evolution of corporate crime and the development of countermeasures. The publication would serve as both academic text and practical guide for law enforcement officials, regulatory agencies, and corporate compliance officers seeking to implement advanced detection systems. Victoria's health had remained robust despite the stress of their high-profile advocacy work, but she had begun transferring operational responsibilities to younger colleagues while maintaining strategic oversight of the Sterling Thompson Institute's research agenda. Her focus had shifted toward international policy, development, and diplomatic efforts to strengthen cooperation between law enforcement agencies in different countries. Marcus's consulting work with federal agencies had evolved to include training programs for new generations of forensic accountants, whose skills would be essential for implementing Emma's algorithmic detection systems. His experience in manual analysis provided crucial context for understanding the patterns that automated systems were designed to identify, ensuring that human expertise remained central to financial crime investigation. The family traditions that Victoria, Marcus, and Emma had developed included annual visits to the courthouse where Harrison Blackwood and his co-conspirators had been sentenced, serving as reminders of their responsibility to continue protecting society from corporate criminal enterprises. These pilgrimages reinforced their commitment to vigilance against corruption while celebrating their success in creating positive change through individual courage and collective action. Emma's romantic relationship with Dr. David Martinez, a cybersecurity researcher at the Brookings Institution, had developed through their shared interest in using technology to combat international criminal organizations. Their collaboration on research projects had evolved into personal partnership that complemented their professional goals while creating possibilities for new innovations in financial crime prevention. The wedding planning that occupied Emma's attention during her final semester had been complicated by security considerations related to their family's high-profile role in law enforcement and corporate accountability. The guest list required approval from federal marshals, while the venue needed enhanced protection measures to ensure safety from potential retaliation by criminal organizations whose operations their work had disrupted. Victoria's role as mother of the bride represented the culmination of relationships that had developed through adversity and mutual support rather than biological connection. Her adoption of Emma had been formalized through legal proceedings, but the emotional bonds between them had been forged through shared experiences and common values that transcended traditional family structures. The legacy that Victoria and Marcus would leave through their daughter's work extended far beyond their personal achievements in exposing corporate corruption and reforming financial regulations. Emma's research represented the foundation for a new generation of crime prevention technologies that would protect countless innocent people from exploitation by sophisticated criminal enterprises operating across international boundaries. The future that stretched before their family held opportunities for continued service in corporate accountability and financial transparency that would build upon the foundation they had established through decades of investigation, advocacy, and reform. Emma's career would carry their mission into new realms of technology and international cooperation that had been impossible when their partnership began in a corporate conference room, where a janitor and a CEO discovered their shared commitment to justice. Their story demonstrated that individual courage and expertise could challenge institutional corruption while creating positive change that protected countless innocent people from criminal exploitation. The family they had created through adversity had become a symbol of hope for others who faced similar challenges in exposing wrongdoing at personal risk, proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results through persistence, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice. 25 years after a chance encounter in a corporate conference room changed the landscape of American business forever, Marcus Thompson walked through the renovated halls of what had once been Sterling Dynamics headquarters. The marble floors that he had once cleaned now gleamed beneath the footsteps of hundreds of researchers, investigators, and advocates whose work continued the mission he and Victoria had begun with nothing more than moral courage and forensic expertise. The building's transformation into the Global Center for Financial Integrity stood as a monument to the principle that individual actions could reshape entire systems when guided by unwavering commitment to justice. The 38th floor conference room where their partnership had been forged now served as a meditation space, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering the same panoramic view of Manhattan that had witnessed their first conversation about corporate corruption and personal responsibility. Victoria Sterling Thompson sat in her emeritus office on the 40th floor, reviewing the final manuscript of her memoirs while autumn sunlight streamed through windows that Marcus had once cleaned in. Anonymity. Her book, titled The View from the Top and Bottom, would be published simultaneously in 17 languages, ensuring that their story reached audiences around the world who continued to face similar challenges in confronting institutional corruption and criminal infiltration of legitimate business operations. The memorial garden on the building's rooftop terrace honored the memory of those who had lost their lives exposing corporate crimes, including Margaret Henley, whose tragic end had served as a stark reminder of the psychological toll that criminal complicity could exact even on those who had initially been unwilling participants in systematic fraud. The peaceful space provided reflection opportunities for visitors who came to study the techniques and principles that had enabled ordinary people to challenge extraordinary corruption. Emma Martinez Thompson stood before the United Nations General Assembly, delivering her final report as director of the International Financial Crime Prevention Initiative. Her decade of service with the organization had resulted in the implementation of algorithmic detection systems in over 100 countries, preventing an estimated $50 billion in money laundering operations while facilitating the prosecution of thousands of corporate criminals worldwide. The technology that Emma had developed during her doctoral studies had evolved into a comprehensive platform that could analyze financial transactions across multiple currencies, banking systems, and regulatory frameworks in real time. The artificial intelligence networks that powered these systems were trained on data from the original Sterling Dynamics case, ensuring that the patterns Marcus had identified through manual analysis continued to inform contemporary crime prevention efforts. Dr. David Martinez watched his wife's presentation from the diplomatic gallery, their 3 children seated beside him with the quiet attention that came from growing up in a household where international cooperation and financial transparency were dinner table conversations rather than abstract policy concepts. The next generation of the family had inherited not only intellectual curiosity about complex systems but also moral conviction about using their talents for public service rather than personal enrichment. The audience included representatives from central banks, regulatory agencies, and law enforcement organizations whose cooperation had been essential for implementing the global financial monitoring network that Emma's research had made possible. The diplomatic protocols that enabled such collaboration had been developed through years of painstaking negotiation, guided by principles that Victoria and Marcus had established through their original investigation. Sarah Chen Thompson watched the proceedings via secure video link from her laboratory in Geneva, where her research into genetic therapies had saved countless children while demonstrating that international scientific cooperation could achieve results impossible through isolated national efforts. Her friendship with Victoria and Marcus had endured despite the divorce that had reshaped their family structure, creating a model for how personal relationships could evolve to serve broader purposes beyond traditional marriage arrangements. The ceremony concluding Emma's tenure with the United Nations included the announcement of her appointment as the first director of the newly established Corporate Accountability Institute at Harvard University, where she would train the next generation of financial crime investigators while continuing to develop detection technologies for emerging threats. Her academic position would enable her to influence policy development through research and education rather than direct operational involvement. Marcus's speech at the ceremony emphasized the continuing relevance of fundamental investigative principles despite the technological advances that had transformed financial crime detection over the previous 2 decades. He reminded the audience that algorithms and artificial intelligence systems were tools that enhanced human judgment rather than replaced it, requiring operators with moral courage and ethical commitment to ensure their effective implementation. Victoria's remarks focused on the institutional changes that had resulted from their original investigation, including legislative reforms, regulatory enhancements, and international cooperation agreements that had strengthened the global financial system's resistance to criminal infiltration. She emphasized that these structural improvements required constant vigilance and periodic updates to address new threats that emerged as criminal organizations adapted to changing technological and regulatory environments. The private reception that followed the public ceremony brought together individuals whose lives had been touched by the Sterling Thompson family's contributions to corporate accountability and financial transparency. The gathering included former federal prosecutors who had built their careers on cases derived from the original Sterling Dynamics investigation, regulatory officials whose agencies had been strengthened through reforms inspired by their advocacy work, and academic researchers whose scholarship had been enabled by the precedents they had established. Emma's children listened with fascination as elderly attendees shared memories of the dramatic congressional hearings that had followed the Hartwell Industries scandal, their young minds absorbing lessons about civic responsibility and moral courage that would influence their own career choices in years to come. The oral history of their family's achievements was being passed to a new generation that would face different challenges but could draw upon the same principles of integrity and persistence. The retirement announcement that Marcus and Victoria made during the reception surprised few who had observed their gradual transition from active investigation to advisory roles over the previous several years. Their decision to step back from operational responsibilities reflected confidence that the institutions they had helped establish possessed the strength and independence necessary to continue their mission without direct family involvement. The foundation that would manage their ongoing philanthropic activities had been structured to provide sustained support for financial crime research while avoiding the governance problems that had plagued other charitable organizations established by wealthy individuals. The board included representatives from academia, government, and civil society organizations whose diverse perspectives would ensure that funding decisions served public interests rather than donor preferences. Marcus's final day as a consultant to federal law enforcement agencies was marked by a ceremony in the same courthouse where Harrison Blackwood had been sentenced 24 years earlier. The federal judge who had presided over that trial, now in her 80s, delivered remarks acknowledging the lasting impact of their investigation on American corporate governance and international law enforcement cooperation. Victoria's farewell address to the Sterling Thompson Institute staff emphasized the evolution of their mission from reactive investigation of specific crimes to proactive development of systems that prevented criminal infiltration of legitimate business operations. She reminded her colleagues that their work protected not only financial institutions and their shareholders, but also the broader democratic societies that depended on transparent and accountable economic systems. The personal legacy that Marcus and Victoria would leave extended beyond their professional achievements to encompass the family they had created through shared adversity and common purpose. Their marriage had demonstrated that partnerships based on intellectual compatibility and moral conviction could endure the pressures of public scrutiny and professional demands while creating opportunities for mutual growth and service to others. Emma's own children represented the fourth generation influenced by the values and principles that had guided their great-grandparents' decision to expose corporate corruption despite personal risk. The bedtime stories they heard included accounts of courage and persistence that would shape their understanding of civic responsibility and individual agency in confronting institutional problems. The quiet retirement that Marcus and Victoria planned would include travel to countries where their work had influenced policy development, meetings with researchers and advocates whose efforts continued their mission, and writing projects that would preserve their experiences for future generations facing similar challenges. Their home overlooking Central Park would serve as an informal headquarters for ongoing consultation and mentorship activities. The circle that had begun with a chance encounter between a stressed executive and a knowledgeable janitor was now complete, having generated institutional changes that protected millions of people from financial exploitation, while demonstrating the power of individual integrity to reshape entire systems. Their story had proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when guided by moral courage and equipped with specialized knowledge. The Manhattan skyline that spread beyond their apartment windows continued to pulse with the ambitions and dreams of countless individuals who sought success through both legitimate enterprise and criminal conspiracy. But the regulatory systems and detection technologies that Marcus, Victoria, and Emma had helped establish provided enhanced protection for those who played by the rules, while creating greater risks for those who sought profit through deception and corruption. Their legacy lived on in the institutions they had reformed, the technologies they had developed, and the principles they had demonstrated through decades of service to corporate accountability and financial transparency. The janitor and the CEO, who had discovered each other by chance, had created changes that would protect future generations from the predatory criminal enterprises they had exposed through courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.